Well, hello everyone. I want to continue our 21st century policing conversations. I hope that you've been able to tune in and check out those ones on domestic violence, those that Lieutenant Smith did on 𝘊𝘰𝘯𝘪𝘠𝘬𝘳. Those are all things that are very, very important. And President Obama's 21st century policing structure it had Chief Ramsey kind of as the head that organized the 6 pillars. And what I'm trying to do is a lot of the conversations that are going on in police reform today focus a lot around those pillars. It's just taking them a little bit of a step further. So it is my hope in these sessions that we have that we're calling 21st Century Police Conversations, where we set up a taping and you hear a little bit about our current process, and then a few days later that they're able to have a question and answer or an open dialogue through Facebook Live, which I'm learning to do better and better, but I'm still working on it. So today we're going to continue in that process, and we're going to talk about our use of force review board. We're going to lay out how it came about, what it is, what they do, and then on November the 5th at 12 noon, I would encourage, and I've been at community meetings and talked about some of this before, but I would encourage any citizen that is interested or would like to know more about it to please chime in, and we can have some open dialogue and discussions. So we have here in Newport News, we have a police use of force review board. So what I want to talk about today is what is the use of force, how do officers do it, how do we know about the reports in itself, and then how do we decide what we address. And I think all those 3 things are important, so I just want to spend about a minute on each one. A use of force is anything that officers do when they put someone under arrest or have to detain someone that is anything other than normal handcuffing procedures. So anytime that we would use our ASP baton, our OC spray, a taser, anytime that we would have to physically wrestle someone, if an individual has a warrant on file for a shooting or a murder or a robbery and they take off running and we're running after them and tell them to stop, and if we end up tackling them to the ground and roll around and there's a struggle before they're handcuffed, that's a use of force. And we have to do what's called a use of force report that is sent through the chain, meaning through their sergeant, their lieutenant, their captain, their deputy chief, and then it goes to the use of force review board, and we'll talk about that when we get there. The other times we do this report is anytime anyone complains of injury. So it could be something where an individual is handcuffed for a particular crime, and they say, the handcuffs are too tight, I think you've hurt my wrist, or I was handcuffed and I'm having trouble breathing, or I was handcuffed and I'm having chest pains, I'm having anxiety. Anytime anyone complains of injury or of illness, we are now responsible. We take that individual to the hospital for treatment, but we do a use of force. So you may ask, well, if someone just turns around and puts their hands behind their back and they have a warrant on file and they're arrested, but there's no force used, we still do a use of force because they complained of injury, right? If there is a struggle and someone goes to the ground and scrapes their hand or their knee, and they say, no, we're fine, we still do a use of force report because there's a visual sign of injury. So any complaint of injury, whether we see it or not, and any injury that we see, even if someone doesn't want to complain about it, we still are documenting that. And then anytime that we use anything other than just a regular force, a regular handcuffing technique, that's documented. We call that self-reporting, and we're mandated. We track that every year to know how many use of force reports we do. It allows me to see, are we going up or are we going down? So I look at the number of use of force complaints we have, and I also look at the number of use force incidents. So if I have 25 use of force situations, but I only have 2 complaints, I measure that. Is our percentage up or down? We average somewhere between 7 or 8 use of force incidents a month. So if you times that by 12, that gives you kind of our yearly average. And we publish that in our report, our annual report at the end of the year. It's important for us to track those things. So that's the first. That's how they're reported and what they are. So officers do those reports. Every officer in Newport News has a body-worn camera. All 464. Now, there are times in struggles that body-worn camera is magnetized. So if it is an intense struggle or goes on, it could fall off. You'll still hear audio, but you may not see the video. We've gone away from them on the hats and the sunglasses, and now we just use the center mounts for the most part. And we just did a big upgrade as technology advances to try to get better visual and audio. So we created, 2 years ago, we created a use of force review board. So when I got to town, when I became the chief here of this city, the reports would come through, it would have photographs, and I would look through it, and the chief would make the determination if the use of force is in policy, if it's out of policy, or if it's in policy that, hey, there's something we could do better in training to try to not, the same situation may not happen again. And our use of force policy is very, very clear. It explains what use of force is. So I'm going to pause here for a second. There is a big difference between use of force and excessive force. After I explain these two, we're going to talk about our use of force review board. Use of force, I've explained, is any time that something other type of physical action besides just normal handcuffing techniques. Our ass baton, physical struggle, a takedown, a use of taser, or OC spray. Excessive force. Probably the best way for me to do is give an example. Excessive use of force. An individual stopped in a car, they have a warrant on file. They get out of the car and they put their hands behind their back and they're taken into custody. That's an arrest. They get out of the car and they take off running. We chase that individual. We're able to catch up with them. There's a struggle. We have to use our OC spray. That is a use of force report. Traffic stop, individual's wanted, takes off running, officer gives chase, catches that individual, uses OC spray, and then 3 or 4 other officers come over and use OC spray. 3 or 4 other officers come over and there's physical interaction. That is what we call excessive force, and that is illegal. Those situations are sent to the Commonwealth Attorney to make a determination if they are in fact criminal or illegal. Sometimes there are things called improper force. An individual may be arrested in handcuffs, and I'd like to stand up. We like to have them sit down. Or can I move around a little bit or talk on my phone, and we don't allow them, right? So when I look at improper force, it's, you know what, this individual didn't need to be OC sprayed, he gave up. It's not excessive, but it's improper. It's not in our policy and procedure. So an individual in that same traffic stop gets out of the vehicle, and instead of just putting him in handcuffs or her in handcuffs, we were to OC spray them. So why would we do that? So we haven't used excessive, but it might be improper. There was no need to do that. Well, I thought they were going, and we allow, well, we're going to talk about that, how we allow officers to talk about what they do. Before, they would just be written, and I would, as the chief, read their statement. It's 2020. I don't think that's the best way to do things. And I want to be transparent with this department. I want to be transparent with our community. So we created a use of force review board, and it's morphed somewhat over the last year. So in 2019, we created a use of force review board that consisted of an officer, sergeant, lieutenant, a captain, and 2 citizens. And we would present the case. Internal Affairs would show the body-worn camera video unedited, right? Completely unedited. You would see officers get hit, spit on, assaulted. You would see officers interacting with citizens, and you would sometimes see officers saying things they shouldn't say. Sometimes things get wrapped up in the heat of physical interactions, right? Confrontations. And what we asked the group to vote on is it in policy? Is it out of policy? Or is it in policy, but hey, there's some things we could do better? For example, if I go to Sarah's house every Friday, and Sarah likes to drink, and she gets loud and disorderly, and we have to arrest Sarah, and every time we go to arrest Sarah, there's a fight. But what we realize is, if we send a female officer to Sarah's address, things de-escalate. So if we get called to that address or we send officers, the use of force is proper, it's valid. But hey, some better ways is if we have a female officer available, if we can send a female officer, it changes maybe the force of interaction that we have with Sarah. It's those type of things that instead of on situations that we wait for 2 or 3 officers to get there instead of 1 officer walking into a house with domestic violence, the issues of use of force decrease. If we get a supervisor on scene, it's proven, facts and case studies, that use of force decrease. Complaints also decrease. So the only prerequisite I have, we don't just pick citizens out of the blue. We do ask that citizens go under, or attend, I should say, our Citizens Academy. In that academy, there are 2 sessions that talk about what force is, what I'm trying to give cliff notes of, what force is and how it's applied, how it's taught, what the law is of our country, of our state, our policies and procedures. You need to understand that. And then they can make a judgment on if it's in policy, out of policy, or in policy, but needs maybe some different training. Think about the time it would take to go through that training each session before we watch the 6, 7, 8 videos. So we run 2 or 3 Citizens Academies a year with about 25 people. When we were having talk to civilians on the Use of Force Review Board, we would do it every month. So in February, we would look at all the cases in January. In March, we would look at all the cases in February. 2 citizens a month. We were doing up to 24 citizens that got to see how this department interacted. In 2 years, it would be 48 different citizens. Now, sometimes it's hard with scheduling and people work, so people can't always, we do different groups. It's not always the same citizens. And it's not always the same officer, sergeant, lieutenant, and captain, because I'm also trying to use it as a learning experience for officers to see questions that citizens ask, for sergeants and lieutenants to see, hey, how are we doing on training? How are we doing on our responses to use of force? And our captains to have a higher view of how the department's doing as a whole. The Use of Force Review Board is chaired by either Chief Grinstead or myself, or non-voting members. As I saw police reform and we saw what happened in Minneapolis and Atlanta and Wisconsin, I wanted to expand, and we had talked about doing it in January of 2021, but we were able to do it about midsummer this year. Instead of 4 officers, officer, captain, sergeant, lieutenant, and 2 civilians, we went to make it even. 4 civilians and 4 representatives from the department. And I think that is the best method. It has been extremely beneficial. 4 individuals who have gone through the Citizens Academy. Some repeat, some are unable to. So maybe 4 new individuals, or 3 and 1 that's done it before. But to have 8 people that vote, and if there's a deadlock, right, the chairman, myself, or Chief Grinstead, we do not vote. All we do is facilitate the meeting. If it's a deadlock, we send the case to Internal Affairs to do a thorough investigation. And that's important. We show the body-worn camera. Behind me is the screen that oftentimes we will use to show the body-worn camera footage unedited. We don't cut it and splice it. We'll try to show a minute up to before the force is used about why. Here's what the call was. Here's what officers saw when they got there. The actual force. And then usually a minute after to show, hopefully, the de-escalation and reconciliation. But I think that's important. I think it's important for our citizens to be involved. We've had individuals that are school teachers, principals, people that work at banks, individuals that are retired, members of the NAACP, construction workers, people that have an interest in what goes on in this community. And I try to use it to be transparent with this department, in its community, our citizens, you, and also as a learning tool for our officers. And again, they decide such things as, is it in policy? Is it out of policy? This force was completely unneeded. Or is it in policy, but there's some things we can do better in training? It has been very, very beneficial. And I try to have conversations with the civilians afterwards and ask them what they think, how they feel. And most of them say, we had no idea. I remember one teacher professional in education said, we use more force than that in the hallways than you do than what we're seeing. Oh my gosh, we can't believe the stuff that officers take and put up with. So I think it is eye-opening, but we don't always get it right. I want to be very, very clear. We don't always get it right. We make mistakes. We're human. We get calls at 2, 3 in the morning. Some situations we think we're walking into are somewhat different. But that's why I think it is best to have citizens involved. Not all officers, not all citizens, but bringing people together. Because oftentimes citizens will ask, well, is this policy or is that? I should tell you, sort of around the room, we also have a representative from Internal Affairs who's showing the videos. We have an instructor from our training academy that talks about what is proper training and procedure. Now, there are circumstances that might change, but in life-threatening situations or in dire situations, but for the most part, we don't tase someone from behind. If someone is running and we tase them and their muscles lock up and they fall forward, we try not to tase anyone from behind. But are there times when we're in a fight and someone may reach for a firearm that we have to tase someone? Absolutely. But for the most part, we don't tase people we don't teach that when someone's running away that we would fire a taser and hit them in the back because they would fall forward and they would hurt themselves, right? So we look at those things. I think that's important, and I think it has been very, very beneficial to this department and from our citizens, not only input and the questions they ask. We also didn't mention that every officer who uses force or does a use of force report, we invite them to come and they can explain why they did what they did. I think that's also valuable. That's education for our citizens, our community. It's transparent. It also allows the officer to hear questions that citizens or other officers might have, or sergeants and lieutenants, to give those responses. It's a whole 360 approach about how we do what we do. The last thing I want to talk about our use of force review board. It is not where decisions are already made and people are just reviewing it. The citizens and the officers represented also decide how we handle the results. Meaning, if it's in policy, there's nothing at all. If it's in policy, but we think we might do some better training, they can make those recommendations. We'll look at that because our training academy is here listening to their input. But the other, if the officer is wrong, if the officer used force when he didn't need to, then we can talk about either discipline and we can talk about training to correct that issue. When I talk about discipline, it can be something, or corrective measure maybe is a better word. It can be something from a sit down with a verbal conversation between the sergeant and the officer. It can be something written. This is going in your file. It can be something that is where you accumulate points for discipline, and then we track that. And if we have so many points over a time frame or an officer's career, it can be detrimental. And that stays in a file until that officer retires or separates from the organization. That puts a lot of power at that use of force review board. It allows the officer to explain. We have people in the room to answer questions about law and about training. The citizens and the officers represented get a bird's eye view of exactly what happened. We don't edit the video at all. You'll hear some profanity, and when you think about it, anytime that you have to physically have interaction, OC spray or aspeton or taser or physical confrontation, it's not pretty. People don't always just give up. You see fights and struggles and foot pursuits, but I think that's understandable. And when it's over, it's over. I think you see officers do an outstanding job of de-escalating. I think you see officers do an outstanding job of taking care of people and treating them. But I will tell you that sometimes we get it wrong. And it's okay to say we're sorry. That's why we have training built into the use of force review board. And I never do anything corrective action or discipline without attaching training to it. Because what's important and what we're trying to do is do better. This is part of the 21st Century Policing Conversations. I wanted to give you sort of an overview of what we've had, how long we have it. It's officers and citizens coming together to try to make this department better, to help us improve on what we do. I look forward to having interactions specifically about this topic on November the 5th. So please chime in, thoughts, ideas, conversations. If you'd like to attend the Citizens Academy, we even have Monica White and I think it's Lieutenant Morgan. They're going to talk a little bit about our Citizens Academy. We run several, and it's very, very important. It gives you an insight of what this department does and why. Thank you for joining me today. I hope I didn't take too much of your time up, but I think these conversations are important, and it's a lot about the national conversation that we're hearing around the country. So please be safe, God bless, and we'll see you and talk to you on November the 5th.